Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Craig Hardesty, and I'm with Out on Film. And we're delighted to have you here for this special screening and talkback about Brother Outsider, the life of Bayard Rustin. And we are having a conversation tonight with co producer and director Nancy Cates. And Nancy, welcome to Out on Film, and thank you for joining us. For those of you who don't know, Nancy worked on this film, which premiered in 2003 at the Sundance Film Festival, and it also appeared on PBS's POV series. And the film has won a number of honors, including a 2004 GLAAD Media Award, as well as audience awards at some major film festivals. Nancy's a 1984 honors grad of the Harvard University, where she studied at the Harvard's Kennedy School, writing public policy case studies before going on to study film at Stanford University. Her films include Their Own Vietnam, which won the 1995 Student Academy Award in documentary, and the award-winning HBO film Regarding Susan Sontag, which screened in over 35 countries. And in addition to that, he was also on the Out 100 in 2014, which is Out Magazine's list of the 100 most influential LGBTQ Americans. So Nancy, we are absolutely thrilled to have you joining us here at Out on Film for this evening. And our conversation tonight is going to be moderated by Chanel Haley of Georgia Equality, as well as being present through a number of activities and organizations throughout the state of Georgia. So Chanel, welcome to this evening and thank you for doing this. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Chanel and Nancy for this conversation.
Thanks, Craig.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So nice to meet you, Nancy. Let's get into this. So I think the first thing to me here that stood out about this film, I want to point out because I recognize this was an issue for a lot of people apparently throughout for several years, is actually even the pronunciation of Bayard Rustin's name. I know I have been saying it wrong for the last 20 years of my life. And so had that been controversial? Have people approached you about that?
How to pronounce it, and it's not a common name. And, you know, it actually comes from, there's a French name, Bayard, and that's where it comes from. It's Bayard, I guess, in French. So, you know, it's not a big deal, but people tend to mispronounce his name. And
yeah, well, no, I think it's a big deal. You know, we all know, I think the same thing when it comes to such as gender identity and pronouns, that, you know, if you want people to respect you and pronounce your name correctly, he's not here to fight and have people pronounce it correctly. And so it definitely is up to us who is trying to carry on his name and his legacy that we are saying it correctly. So that's why I brought that up. I think it is important that we know that now.
I guess I just wanted to say that I think Mr. Rustin would always be more interested in the content than in the pronunciation, right? So, you know, I don't know him, but he, you know, I think it's fun. I love it when people pronounce his name correctly, but it only happens like 40% of the time. So
right. So speaking of getting to know about Mr. Rustin and you wanting to do this film, where was the motivation coming from? Why now? You know, what prompted you to, out of every historical figure or activist, particularly when it comes to Black activists, why him?
Well, the film was actually completed in 2003, so it's not exactly why now, but I mean, one thing that's been really moving to me and the other people who worked on the film is that it's been kind of an evergreen, and generations of people have watched our film and been interested. And maybe if they've never heard of him, then they get to see it in 2021 and it's new to them, and other people saw it when it came out, you know. And I now meet people who are middle-aged who say they saw it in college, and then I feel old, right? But I had the idea for the film in 1997, a book called, I think it's called Bayard Rustin Troubles I've Seen by Jervis Anderson came out. Jervis Anderson was an African-American writer for The New Yorker who passed away a number of years ago. In fact, he passed away not long after we started working on the film. But I read a review of this book in the New York Times Book Review, and I thought, wow, someone needs to make a film about this man. I had sort of heard of him, but not, yeah, I didn't know anything about him. And, that's where this started. And I just, I looked at his life, that he started being an activist when he was 15 and continued for 60 years until he died. And I thought, the rest of us, what are we doing on the planet? Look what he did with his life. We get one shot at being alive and being human. And he, was so important in so many movements, so transformational, so unknown. And I just thought, I tend to make stories of, films about people that are unknown or lesser known, or tell stories that haven't been told before. And I just thought, this is really, really important, the story, and people didn't know about him. So that's how it started.
Yeah, that's one thing I think that I learned from watching the film also, is that, when we think about leaders, we think about always being in the forefront, but he was absolutely comfortable with also being in the background. And, that to me is a superior leadership quality, is that not needing to always be in the spotlight and making sure, and still keeping the wheels moving around a movement, which takes me to actually even the march.
Can I make a comment? Yeah. I apologize for interrupting you, but I wanted to call the film Edges of the Frame, because he was never in the center. He was always standing behind Dr. King, or to the side, or on the edge, or there'd be a line of protesters and he'd be over here, or he'd be whispering to someone to tell them what to do. And you're right, like, being in the background is not considered as sexy. And certainly Rustin loved to be in the spotlight too. He was a very charming man. He was handsome. He could sing. I mean, he had lots of lovers, but he was willing to be in the background because that's what was needed. And I think it's actually, I'm glad you brought it up, because it's not something that people talk about enough with him, that he could have been in the spotlight more, actually, or maybe he would have been if he hadn't been gay, but he was okay not being in the spotlight.
Yeah, you brought something else about his singing. I mean, that alone, I think probably the one of several things that came up through this film that I had no idea about, that he was a recording artist. Like, he's actually recorded music. Why wasn't that something that was pursued as a career, do you think, or have you been told?
Well, he did sing with Josh White in the Carolinians. I can't say that. Carolinians in the 30s. I think he thought about it, and he could have done it, and maybe he just wanted to have a political life. I mean, I don't think anyone really answered that question, but I think he made a conscious decision in, say, 1939, 1940. He had moved to New York. He was taking classes at City College. He was sort of flirting with communism at that point. And I think he just thought there were too many things to work on. And he'd already been an activist, even as a teenager. So, there are lots of musicians who are scientists or something. He was a musician, activist. And I think he also used his music in his activism throughout his life. You can see him at the end of the film singing to a group of people who don't English, and he was able to reach them by singing. So, was it unfortunate that he didn't have a longer professional musical career? Maybe. I don't know. I mean, it's a really interesting kind of philosophical question about what kind of voice you want to have in the world too. Not to get heavy, but music really reaches a lot of people, and he also, he reached millions of people by organizing and activism and the legacy he left. So I don't know. I can't answer your question about exactly why he chose it, but I think he probably just thought racism was such an urgent problem that he wanted to work on it directly. I mean, I'm not speaking for him. That's just my guess.
No, I understand. And I brought the question up, again, because I don't think most people even knew that he was engaged in that. But then also, comparing then to now, and how so many of our activists really like spotlight and will take the path that gets them the most followers or viewers, right? And so obviously, if you are a recording artist and you can do all these different things, you might get more viewers. And so I just thought it was interesting of comparing, 50 years, 60 years, about how choosing one path of being able to get your point across and your mission is different than it is a person would do it now. Now they would totally want YouTube and followers and Instagram and like, if, singing and putting a song out is going to do that for me, I'm going to do that versus, marching in the streets.
Well, I should say one other thing about the music, which is that because he didn't leave a diary behind, the fact that he did leave these recordings behind really helped us make the film. When he sings, like, sometimes I feel like a motherless child, and you're watching this nuclear test going off in Africa, it has a weight because of his voice and, the beauty of his voice. And he's playing the lute while he's writing letters to his boyfriend while he's in prison in World War II, et cetera, et cetera. It was very helpful for us to have his music. And I think it made the film much deeper than it would have been without it. So we were fortunate in that regard as well.
Is his music somewhere that someone can find to purchase?
I don't know. I think it was reissued on CD, like they were originally LPs, right? Because they were produced probably in the 50s, but I don't really know if they're available now. That's a really good question.
Okay. The other, so more questions. Another thing I think that was probably new for me was, I'm not sure if most people know that he is the organizer for the March on Washington, because I think that we're ignorant and believe that was the Dr. King thing, since that was the headliner, right? And so you talk a little more about that, because again, this is another example of him not being in the spotlight, and this amazing event that took place.
Americans are very ignorant about our own history. In fact, I saw this guy, this is a little bit of a tangent, but I saw this motivational speaker who was talking about, he was using Dr. King as an example of like how to brand yourself in business. And he was saying, well, Dr. King, got his message out, even though, there was no internet, some people would come to his march. And I just was like going crazy, because A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin were the ones who created the March on Washington. Dr. King was the keynote speaker. It was not his march. I mean, the NAACP and the Urban League and the AFL-CIO and Black churches were the ones who got people there. But this guy, like, I tried to write a letter to this, idiotic man who was abusing American history to try to make a point about advertising. So again, people don't know, because it was an entire day of speakers and singers and all sorts of other things that happened on the March on Washington. But the only thing that anyone remembers is Dr. King's speech, which of course was fantastic. But, it wouldn't have happened without Rustin and the other people who organized the march getting 250,000 people to Washington. That was the largest demonstration that had ever been held in the history of the United States at that point. Think about it. There was no internet. There were no cell phones. Right. Ernest Green makes this point in the film. And it was a transformative moment in American history. So it is sad to me that people don't know that Rustin was really the key to the whole thing. But, he also understood that the civil rights movement could not achieve what it was going to achieve without having a charismatic leader, an inspiring leader. And that's what Dr. King provided. And it's not even in our film, but Rustin was also, the person who thought that they needed an organization for Dr. King. So the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was actually Rustin's idea. And we decided not to make a big deal out of it in our film, because it wasn't really central to his story. It was more central to King's story. And, that was a difficult thing about making this film, was to try to honor Dr. King, but sort of leave him to other histories, and to pull Rustin out of the corner of the frame and shine a light on him. So.
There was two very powerful things that was said in there to me that I thought that in the film. One of them being, I think it was in the, I think it was 1943, but it was when Bayard was, on the bus and sitting in the front. So this is, of course, what 20 years before Rosa Parks, okay? And asked to move, refused to move, was being drug off. And there was a white little girl sitting across from him. And he said that he felt it was important to do this, because how else would that little girl know that there was an injustice being done? To me, that was very powerful because
I think actually. So in 1946, the Supreme Court in 46, the Supreme Court issued the Irene Morgan decision, which said that segregation on interracial buses was illegal, but it was not enforced in the South. And so the Journey of Reconciliation, which Rustin organized with other members of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which was the Christian pacifist group that he was working with, they decided to test this law, and because they knew that the law was on their side, but in the South, of course, people weren't. I'm sorry, I don't want to say anything bad about the South, but it wasn't being enforced. I don't live in the South, so I can't like. Well, I'm talking about
it's history. It's still not being enforced, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, but I mean, so these very brave people. Yeah, this was long before Rosa Parks. It was long before the Freedom Rides of the '60s. I mean, people think that the Freedom Riders in 1962 were the first people to do this, but they weren't. And Rustin always had a sort of, his life was full of teachable moments, is what we would say about them today, right? And so when he said that about the little girl who could see this, I think he hoped that new generations would arise that would be not engaged in Jim Crow racism in the South or anywhere else. And, don't get me started about our current moment, but, we go forward and we go backwards. And I wish we had Bayard Rustin today, that's for sure. That's not what you asked me, so please,
No, yeah. I mean, definitely, we need more people. Definitely like him. I think that today's generation is definitely doing it. As a person that's been engaged in demonstrations and activism on the front lines, behind the lines, I think that we definitely today are seeing this generation that is willing to stand up and with no apologies, which leads me to something that I debate with many times with younger generations. And I have said something similar with them that Bayard has said, but I'm glad to see this in a film, and I'm going to play this for them all the time. But this was against the difference between protest versus politics. And, you're doing protesting, it absolutely makes sense to not compromise, versus politics is always compromise. And that definitely is something I think that we need to drive home a lot and see, particularly with the work that's been done around politics. And as you said, as a person who lives here in the South in Georgia, even though the policy laws have been changed, they still are not always being implemented. So I'm so happy that was put in there. And that we heard it from his actual voice too. It wasn't something that was passed along.
Well, in the latter part of the film, you see him debating Stokely Carmichael, who became Kwame Ture, and Malcolm X. And both of those were actually Rustin giving those other people an opportunity to speak. I mean, that we didn't go into the whole behind the scenes of why he was debating Malcolm, but it was really because Malcolm had been invited to Howard and not allowed to speak because the university decided he was too radical. So Rustin said, well, I'll debate him and they'll have to let him speak. So in both cases, it often looks like Rustin's losing these debates, but he's really there almost really as an ally to help these other people have a moment, where people can listen to them. And, and there is a sort of generational thing that happens as well, right? That he was a young radical and then he became kind of like a silvered haired, elder. And then the young people behind him were more radical and thought that he was too conservative, and he also got more conservative when he decided that he needed to work with the Democratic Party. But the trajectory of his life is also that the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Acts were passed so that people could finally vote. And so therefore, mainstream politics were more possible in terms of civil rights agendas than they had been before Black people were allowed to vote. So, I think Rochelle Horowitz says in the film, he liked marching around in the streets. But once there was some possibility that Black people could be a significant political force in America, he felt like he had to deal with the Democratic Party. If they were completely being voter suppressed, of course, we're still dealing with this today, then marching in the streets would be more effective than trying to get the Democrats to do anything. So it's a strategic issue. But of course, it's much sexier to be a radical than to sit down with people in, smoky rooms and try to work out deals. And even I, as a filmmaker, at times was very exacerbated by him in his later years because he was willing to compromise.
Well, what I've learned in my years of the work that I do is that I think that that's the mold. That's what happens, period, is that with each generation, each new generation thinks the generation before them were too conservative and don't like how they did it. The generation before them is saying that, hey, you're doing it all wrong. And they have to work that out, right? And then, of course, the generation coming after this one is going to say the same thing. And it happens over and over again. And as we get older, we get more conservative. We've, now bought a home, having families. And so our ideas of what we think should and should not be, we've now voted, gotten involved in politics. And so I think that is actually a great example of that, again, even before Dr. King, because most people, when they talk about civil rights, they want to start there, that this is something that's always happened. I think is healthy. I think that having it again on film where we see that this is what generations go through when it comes to activism and moving policy and creating laws for marginalized communities, especially. I am interested and curious to know how is it that Mr. Rustin never, ran for office? Or
Well, I think he felt like he probably, I can't speak for him, but I think he probably assumed that he would just be, excuse me for using this language, tarred and feathered for his sexuality if he were more public about something like running for office, because obviously he had these arrests. I mean, he was arrested a number of times, mostly for political things, a few times for sexual things, but it was just all going to get trotted out if he ran for office. So, it's interesting that Eleanor Holmes Norton has been the congresswoman for DC for so long, because, when we went to interview her, it didn't make it into the film. I was really sad about this, but, I said, do you think that Bayard Rustin's laughing about the fact that you're in the United States Congress when you were part of this generation that was so radical, speaking of this intergenerational thing? And she just started laughing, and she said, like, I don't think he believed in heaven and hell, but yeah, for sure, he would be wildly amused by me and John Lewis and other people who were students, and young people when he was doing the March on Washington. And we, even then we thought he might be too conservative. And now we have to make compromises because we're in the House of Representatives. Right. And I don't know, it just didn't quite fit with everything else in the film, but I loved what she said. And it was sort of like, I felt like it was a little gift to us as filmmakers that we got to hear her say that because, because life is very complicated. Politics are very complicated. Policy is complicated. He would have been a great senator or representative. I just don't think it would have been possible for him at that time. I mean,
that's the outtakes.
No, but I mean, he died in 1986. Like maybe by then he could have run, but he would have been, a 75-year-old candidate.
Right.
And also, I don't think he was really interested. I mean, as someone says in the film, like he was really quite a free man by that age of his life. Like maybe it wouldn't have been. Maybe the constraints of being an office holder would have been something that he wasn't. But I can't. We're way beyond conjecture. Even I shouldn't. Who knows? It is unfortunate, but I think it's partly about him being gay and partly the times that he actually lived in.
Let's talk a little more about him being gay, his partners or lovers, because there was one feature in the film, but
Two.
There was two. Sorry, okay, could be one. Yes, that's true. Were any of them ever around while doing his work? Because in an atmosphere, we're talking about civil rights and equality, and this is a Black man who has a partner that is not Black. And then you're talking about, the equality here and civil rights and, oppression. So there's that aspect. And then also the aspect that he's a Black man during this time a gay man during this time where that also was shown upon. So was it ever that any of his partners or lovers were actually part of the movement and they were like openly here in the same spaces?
We decided, and this is in some ways a conservative thing that we did, but we decided that you could only talk about Rustin's sex life if you had had sex with him in our movie. No,
Okay.
that's not true for all films, but that was just something that we made. But yeah, he would sometimes seduce these straight boys who were, and they would stand up and proclaim that they had like had this encounter with him, and that because he was so inspiring to them. This is like even in the Quaker world, which is kind of unheard of. But he was lovers with this man named Tom Kahn, who was he worked with him closely. And, I don't know when Kahn died. I think he might have died during the AIDS era, but, we couldn't interview him. He was a younger white man who was who worked closely with Rustin on policy issues and some of the work he did in the labor movement. It's just, he probably had, over 1,000 lovers over the course of his life. And it was just that we actually got to talk to 2 of them, right? And we talked to his friends, and they were reluctant to talk about, the more interstitial kinds of people. One of his peace activist friends, again, this didn't get into the film, like this is like decades and decades later, he looked at me and he said, I saw him with a sailor once, like, with this like massive disapproval, and all I could think of was like, that must have been one hot sailor, like this is a straight friend of his, like saying this and sort of like being disapproving of, what to many people would be a normal gay man's sexual life, right? And one thing I just want to say, like, I spent a lot of time thinking about his sex life and his sexuality as a lesbian, and I never get any credit, right? Like, there's no way that I could really understand what it's like to be a gay man, right? I can't understand that, but I want some credit for having, put the time in and really thought about it. So anyway, I'll stop tooting my horn, but I think it's really important in the LGBTQ plus community for us to think across those differences as well, which is not what you asked me, but
that is what I asked you, because I it wasn't just about him being gay, but also being gay, working in activism and civil rights, but then also his partners are not black men. So that's something that's an extra layer.
I think maybe some of them were, but the ones that we were able to find who were alive, and there were certainly a lot of white men that he was lovers with. And I think that was, was it a strategy? Was it his preference? You tell me. This is where I plead lesbian, but I don't think that it's really fair to analyze someone else's desires, even when they're alive, but certainly not when they're gone.
Okay, great. So
wait, can I say one thing about this? The FBI, tape recorded, like they bugged his phone. So there's extensive conversations about, like when the 1964 Democratic Convention was going on, there's like discussions between him and Tom Kahn about things like the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and are you gonna sleep over tonight? Like it's all on the recordings. So there's, we could have put more of this in the film, but again, I felt really strongly that the best ethical approach was to talk to people who were actually his lovers.
Are the recordings open to the public?
Yeah, you can get them if you file a Freedom of Information Act request. And there are historians who have used those tapes to write more about the history of the Democratic Party and civil rights leaders, et cetera, et cetera. So just as you can also get Dr. King's tapes, which are now the subject of Sam Pollard's new film, MLK FBI. Sam Pollard was the executive producer of our film. So
that's good to know for anybody listening that may want to hear accounts for themselves. And then Dr. King, because it was even mentioned in the film that they had a complicated relationship. Yes. Mr. Rustin was an advisor. Do you see it more as maybe an older brother type relationship?
Yeah, Andrew Young says that in our film, right? That he was like an older brother. I mean, Rustin had gone to India, right? I mean, he missed Gandhi because Gandhi was assassinated, but
Mhm.
he had like a lot of experience doing nonviolent protests that King didn't have when he was 26 years old and the Montgomery bus boycott started. I mean, King grew a lot in a very short amount of time as a leader, but and I think they just had different gifts, right? I mean, obviously King was incredibly inspiring and he was this incredible orator. And I mean, Rustin was a great speaker, but he was really a strategist, and that was his sort of special superpower. So it was they were complements that they complemented each other. And Rustin did not have a. I think King has a PhD from Boston University, but Rustin didn't have that kind of formal education. He was just brilliant and self-taught. So they were I think, and there were times when people said that Rustin was more of a snob than Dr. King, that Dr. King would, eat Southern food and Rustin would want to go to the fancier restaurant or something. But, Rustin collected art and he had this collection of walking sticks and blah, blah, blah. I mean, he was a real New Yorker. But I think Dr. King needed him and he probably didn't like sending him away when he was being attacked for being associated with Rustin. But there was this sense in the civil rights movement that you had to be completely impeccable, that you couldn't
Mhm.
you had to be above reproach, which is why having a group of Southern ministers be in charge of the movement made a lot of sense in terms of the sort of public facing nature of the civil rights movement. And so this quasi openly gay man, like, that wasn't okay in that way of looking at things. I mean, it seems so antiquated now, but
What in your opinion, or what two things? What is your opinion that we should be taking away from this film or about the legacy of Bayard Rustin? And then also, are there any family members that you got contact with that have seen this film and their views about it?
well, his nephew is in the film briefly. I'm so I was looking up this woman's name. Before Rosa Parks, this young woman named Claudette Colvin was arrested, and she was an unwed mom.
Mhm.
And
Yes.
everyone in Montgomery was like, we can't have her be our Rosa Parks figure, right? But that was the nature of, I always forget her name because it's very close to this name of this French actress.
Mhm.
But, you know, she's been forgotten by history because she wasn't considered, morally pure enough to be representative of the civil rights movement. And, nowadays that just wouldn't happen. So I've completely forgotten the other question that you just asked me.
I was
But
asking
to
about
make sure,
the legacy of Bayard Rustin, and it was that what is it that you want people to take away from watching this film? What is it, one at least one thing that you really wanted us to learn about him?
well,
Or
I hate questions because the film is 84 minutes long. Like,
yeah.
one of my colleagues once said, like, you work and you struggle and you try to tell a story, and what you learned is what's on the film. So I hate answering that question. It's like that I told you the story. It's up to you to take something from this. But my mother, because she's my mother, saw the film like 4 times, like in the year it came out. And after the third time, she said, I need to do more. This is my, suburban mom who, God bless her, is now 92, but, she was never an activist. But
Mhm.
she's like, I need to do more. That was her, and I thought that was not a bad response to watching our film through over and over again. But I don't, I want people to think about his legacy. I want people to think about what it means to be both African American and gay, and how intersectionality kind of plays this huge part in this story and in other people's stories. But I'm not the preacher. I'm here to tell a story, and I don't want to, as you may have noticed, there's no narration in our film.
Mhm.
I'm not interested in telling you what to think or what to do. I'm interested in sort of presenting this and letting it sort of filter into the audience's consciousness and hopefully having them take something away. So I'm not answering your question, really. Very politely.
Answer the question. You know, when I asked that question, you know, that's a general question we ask directors and producers, and writers. But also, you know,
Do they
here
often say that though? Do they often sort of duck the question?
they do. They usually will say at least this one thing. I think that what it usually comes down to is probably what is most shocking to viewers, that maybe, or one thing that was most like never known. Like we talked about before, the March of Washington, right? That to me was like, I need you to know this person, this moment in time in history is because of this person, and you didn't know that at all. So for me, that's that. But I named several takeaways for me. And that hits a little home, hits different here at home, because every year here in Atlanta, we have the Bayard, Rustin, Andre Lord breakfast for MLK weekend. And so that's kind of the way we honor. And so even when this comes, like, oh, I thought I knew everything about, or at least a lot about Mr. Rustin, but surprise, watching the film.
People who go to the breakfast watch our film first, you know.
Yeah. We should play that. We should play the film during your breakfast, during the breakfast.
Well, and it's kind of wonderful that the breakfast is also for Audre Lorde, because she was another giant.
Yes.
Wasn't that amazing that Google had her as the doodle the other day?
Yeah.
That was incredible. Anyway, sorry, I'm interrupting.
No, you're not interrupting. In fact, that leads us to, how do we get to see Brother Outsider outside today? Where can we find it?
We sell DVDs on our website, which is rustin.org. It's on Google Play. I think it's on Netflix, but you have to get the actual DVD still, which is so antiquated. Like, I don't know why they have refused to put it on streaming. If you all want to write Netflix a letter, that might actually help things, because it should be available as streaming. It's a little tough because the film came out in 2003, so it's kind of hard to get it on the streaming platforms. I think it might be on Amazon. I should know the answer to this, but you can find it if you look hard. And thank you for asking. And if you want to support our work, you can also donate at rustin.org. Our website's very out of date, but I'm trying to fix it.
Okay. Thank you so much, Nancy Yates, for speaking to us, director, producer, Brother Outsider. Again, my name is Cheryl Haley. From Georgia Equality. This is a great partnership with Out on Film, and we look forward to seeing more and hearing more about this film. I look forward to hearing and seeing more from you. If your directing is always as good when it comes to learning about our historical figures. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you. Take care.
You too.